Welcome PSY 309 students. This is my week 1 commentary as we start our spring 2018 semester. This is still certainly a week of getting started, so hopefully by now you have become familiar with more of the course website and the course design, that you've acquired your course text. If those are not the case, now is the time to be contacting myself so that I can help you get off to a good start. My goal is that by the end of the second week, meaning our first workshop, everybody in the course will be essentially off to a good start. So turning to this week 1 content for this semester, again, I'm going to stick fairly close to the Whitbourne and Whitbourne text so that we are all on common ground as far as the course content is concerned. Needless to say, the difference between course content, textbook content, and course design are all important distinctions. So as we start, and I'll be referencing Chapter 1 in Whitbourne and Whitbourne, my first concern is to make you aware of the history of psychology and the emergence of the fields, first of developmental psychology, then the interdisciplinary field of human development, and now the emergence of a concept called the developmental sciences. So the study of adulthood and of aging occur in a context that is no doubt broader and more complicated than you have interest or time for this semester. Simply let it be said then that there are limitations, and you'll find out that the word limitations is very important to me individually, so that we minimize the harm that we can do in terms of exploring subject matter and gaining a pseudo-mastery of what it is that's really here. So the psychology of adulthood and aging is first and foremost in the minds of those who are adults and aging. That's the individual narrative and insights that we all live with. And I refer to that as the psychology, the purest form of the psyche of adulthood and aging. Now, Susan Krauss Whitbourne, whose family, by the way, has an interesting history of their own, so certainly you might find that worthwhile. But all that being said, she focuses upon identity theory. And I want to take a moment as a clinician to compare and contrast identity with the psyche and specifically the self of adults and aging individuals. So why is this important? Well, it's important because we need to be clear that self-concept and indeed our public image of the self is not the same as the sense of self and the psyche itself. So that Dr. Whitbourne's emphasis upon identity is an emphasis on the psychology of adulthood at the conscious level. And that's really important. We identify ourselves intentionally and consciously. So to that extent, we are managing an evolving image or self-concept that is not the same as our psyche at all, because the psyche also includes the unconscious aspects of the self. So let's first of all note in Chapter 1, identity theory and the concepts of assimilation and accommodation of our identities is very important, particularly to this textbook, but nevertheless is only one level of the psyche, the conscious level of the psyche. Okay, second point in the history of the field. If you go outside of the United States, or indeed outside of what's called the developed world today, you'll find a huge variety of beliefs about the nature of human development. And what you're seeing in our textbook is the view of human adult development at the conscious level, and as studied by the scientific community. I should say the scientific and clinical communities. So that the history of this field is not explored in our textbook, and we really don't have time for it. But it is important in shaping some of our assumptions and some of our limitations that we're not even aware of until we spend a good deal of time in this area. To give you an idea of how young this field is, let me just simply say that developmental psychology itself as a field began at the early part of the 20th century, a little over 100 years ago. And the first textbooks on human development, again, were written only in this period of time. Since then, of course, there's been an explosion of knowledge and research methods that have informed what you're reading about in the textbook. So the takeaway to all this is that history counts, and that there's been a lot of change since the emergence of developmental psychology, not only in our beliefs, but also in our research methods. And we'll come back to that theme again. All of that being said, let me punctuate this first part of my commentary by saying that I do not assume that most of you are desiring to go on to be psychologists, nor to take multiple developmental theory or developmental practice courses, but rather this is an introduction, really, to developmental psychology and adult development in particular. So, although I'm deeply involved in it and have an awareness of the history and the depths of it, I will not inflict these on you. I will just simply say in conclusion that the psyche, the total psychology of adults and the psychology of aging is far more than the academic study of human development as it's being represented in Whitbourne and Whitbourne. That being said, let me hasten to add that I have enormous respect for the Whitbournes. For generations, they have been writing textbooks and contributing to the field in very significant ways. But all of us are limited in our perspectives, and we do well to acknowledge the fact that the information that we're being presented has limitations, and important limitations. Finally, before looking at Chapter 1 in particular, let me say that, and this really is a footnote to what I've just said, that when I think about developmental psychology, I think about the academic field, which Whitbourne and Whitbourne represent. I think about the clinical field, and then I also think about the global perspectives on developmental psychology. So we'll have an opportunity later in the course to revisit these three aspects or facets of the study of adult development and aging. Again, that's the academic, the professional, meaning the applied, and also the global perspectives. Now let me turn to Whitbourne's Chapter 1 in particular. And I want to say again that I look at Whitbourne and Whitbourne as really something like an encyclopedia, meaning that it's an overview of a very broad field in a very limited way. So in Chapter 1, Whitbourne and Whitbourne organize their approach through the use of 4 principles. And principles are important because they filter everything else that we learn and hear from these authors over the course of the semester. So in brief, they lean in the direction of change as being continuous, and the debate in the field is, are there really stages, or ought we look at changes as continuous. My own view, by the way, is both. It's useful to organize the lifespan in stages, knowing the limitations of the research on those stages. So principle 1 in Whitbourne is the changes are continuous. There is, of course, change, but there is also constancy. And the question is, of course, what remains constant as well as what changes with time. The second principle in Whitbourne has to do with survivors and the fact that as we study aging, we tend to study those who are surviving. And this kind of attrition bias and self-selection are important for us to take into account as we dig into the weeds, as it were, of particular topics that might be the foundation for your course project. Individuality matters is the third principle in Whitbourne, and let me say that I look upon this as the snowflake issue. Snowflakes are all the same, but also every snowflake is different. And so if you have a habit of mind of saying you can't really study adult psychology or aging simply because we're all different, I would suggest, and Whitbourne would concur, that that's a false dichotomy, that there is individuality and there are collective patterns. And the fourth and probably most important of the Whitbourne principles has to do with the distinction between aging and disease. That aging is not an illness or a disorder or even a problem. And as we go through the semester, you'll see that periodically I will ask that we leave the textbook, because the textbook, even though it knows of these biases, tends to fall into traps and leave out important areas of the psychology of aging that I will want us to at least acknowledge as we move through the semester. So certainly aging is not the same as disease. It's not a problem. One can frame it in a variety of ways, and I'll be interested on the discussion board how you frame aging, whether you see it as a problem or you see it as an adventure or you see it as the seasons of life here exhibited on our website. Whatever metaphors you frame aging as, be aware of the biases that are intrinsic to those metaphors. All right, those are the four principles that Whitbourne organizes the first chapter. I'll end with just a comment about distinctions between development, growth, and maturation, if I might. Development is, in essence, the broad perspective. Growth has to do with addition primarily, and we in history know about growing up and growing down, and it's really pointing to the bias in the very idea of growth. And so that's development, and that's growth. And then the issue of maturation. Maturation typically is used in this field to speak of unfoldings of patterns, either due to environmental constraints or due to genetic constraints or physiological constraints. And one of the key concepts that you were introduced to in Intro Psych that I hope you'll remember is the biopsychosocial model. The Whitbournes embrace this model, as we all do, and understanding that maturation is not simply a matter of experience, that there is some amount of unfolding on the biological side and on the environmental side. And we will look at the sum total of causality as the biopsychosocial model. The fortunate thing is, and this will be my closing point, is that we can study patterns of change and continuity in adulthood without having to have a final word on what causes them. Just as snow falls and we can study patterns of winter weather, we don't know all of the ins and outs of the causes, but we can be rigorous and open-minded in simply looking at the patterns that are there and asking ourselves if there's something we want to do with them. So I said that would be my last point, and that will be my last point. I'll try to limit the weekly commentaries to content-focused issues, but I will inevitably have to speak to issues of what I call housekeeping as we go through the semester. So I will organize my weekly commentaries principally on the lines of content, but also I'll put in a brief commentary about the housekeeping aspects. Have a good week. And again, if you have questions or concerns, Dr. K's office is good for everything that's not content. And content issues are wonderful grist for the mill in our discussion board activities, which is a graded assignment in the course. Thanks for your attention. I've produced 3 videos for us to get started with, and I know that's a lot. I will be more concise after we are completed with the getting started phase of the course.